The United Nations AIDS Agency admits it made a mistake when estimating the number of people across the globe who are HIV positive. Is it just a statistical correction or a sign of significant progress in the fight against AIDS? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Lauren Taylor. New data from the UN's programme on HIV and AIDS shows the percentage of people living with HIV globally has levelled off and new infections have fallen. The report says approximately 33 million people worldwide are living with the disease. That's down some 6 million from last year, and a decrease, the UN says, is due to a statistical revision. There's more positive news in this global outlook. People with AIDS are living longer and the number of people dying from the disease is down. But the figures are still startling. Almost 7,000 people are infected with HIV every day and close to 6,000 die from AIDS daily. Well, with some areas suffering particularly high rates of infection, the worst hit region remains Africa. According to the UN AIDS report, the region will account for 75% of AIDS-related deaths this year. Again this year, 70% of people infected with HIV worldwide are from sub-Saharan Africa, with the majority of those living with HIV being women. Out of any country, South Africa remains the worst affected. HIV infections there outstrip every other country in the world. Well, joining us to discuss the latest AIDS figures and their significance are our guests. In Geneva, Dr. Yves Souterrain, coordinator of the Strategic Information Unit in the World Health Organization's HIV department. In Washington, D.C., Dr. Paul Zeitz, Executive Director of the Global AIDS Alliance. And in Johannesburg, Dr. Warren Parker, who's the Executive Director of the Centre for AIDS Development Research and Evaluation. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. If I could come to you, first of all, Dr. Souterrain, what would you say is the main reason behind the revision in the figures?
Well, the main reason of this revision are linked with improved methodology for measuring trends in the HIV/AIDS epidemic. It's something that WHO and UNAIDS has started now since a couple of times, and last year was a critical year in the sense that many new data with better methodology and better knowledge about the natural history of the disease has concurred to this decrease of estimation. As you said, 6 million less than last year, which is quite significant.
OK, Dr. Paul Zeitz, do you think that means actual progress?
Well, I think that it's good news that we're investing more in the response and the battle against AIDS in Africa and other parts of the world. We've been putting more money into monitoring and evaluation, and so we're now doing better surveys to understand the scope and the nature of the problem, and so we have a more accurate picture. So I think that is good news. We've also, as you reported, some of the data in the report shows that our investment in prevention programs and our investment in treatment programs are starting to show a return on investment. And we're seeing some reductions in new cases because of those programs. And people are living longer because they're getting access to life-saving AIDS medicines. So that's good news too. The bad news is that while the epidemic is stabilizing, it's still spreading. As you said, nearly 8,000 new infections a day. And also in North Africa and in the Middle East, we're seeing the spread of the virus, as well as TB. Okay, so I think that all parts of the world need to be vigilant.
If I could just bring in Dr. Warren Parker, we mentioned there that Africa is one of the worst hit areas. Why do you think that is? Is it still to do with a lack of resources, or is it the wrong kind of targeting? What's going wrong?
I think it's complex. Africa has many different aspects to it in terms of HIV infection. So the East and North African countries have a different type of epidemic to what we're seeing in South Africa. In South Africa and Southern Africa, we certainly don't have a decline in our prevalence, and we're seeing similar levels of incidence every year. So there's quite a bit more work to be done in terms of looking at the interventions and ensuring that they are directly linked to prevention.
Okay, Dr. Souterrain, is there any kind of change in strategy linked to the revision in figures, or do the methods continue in the same way in terms of where you spend the money?
Well, first, revision of estimation will continue. We need to work with the best evidence and with the best possible data. But as you said, 33 million people living with HIV/AIDS in the world is made of HIV/AIDS the most devastating epidemic of this century and of the previous century. So it doesn't, and it will not affect a lot the resource needs that have been that will be needed for the next 5 to 10 years, and I don't think that it will change dramatically, and even very few is the strategy that needs to be implemented for preventing and for treating the disease.
Dr. Zeitz, is there any way of being sure that the new figures are any more reliable than the last? I mean, after all, one of the problems, I suppose, with HIV is people don't necessarily know they have it.
Well, that's true, and I think we need to continue scaling up the programs to offer voluntary counseling and testing, and provider-initiated testing is also important. More people need to know their status so that they can change their behavior if they're implementing high-risk behavior, and also that they can access life-saving AIDS medicines. The world needs to take this data and say, we've had some success. We need to ramp up our investment. We still have a huge shortfall in the resources being provided to respond. And so we need the oil-producing states, we need the European governments, Japan, and the United States all to work in solidarity to go to the next level so that we can win the battle against HIV and AIDS.
Dr. Parker, do you think that in organisations like UNAIDS are getting it right in the kind of methods they have for trying to target a worldwide disease?
I think it's very complex. Firstly, I think the thing that is most important is to really try and emphasize that planning is built on numbers that are as accurate as possible. So even if it requires statistical revisions to get the numbers right, it's the basis for how we understand how to plan around the disease.
Dr. Souterrain, if I could bring you back in, there are places like Asia where the rate of growth is sort of bigger than others. Why is that happening? Why are there particular places where the figures are going up?
Probably for different reasons. First, the epidemic has started later in this part of the world than in Africa, for example. So it continued to increase at a very high rate. Second, there are many group of population who are more exposed to the risk of contamination, which are infected more and more with a rate of increase which is more and more high. So I think that it's a part of the world for which commitment to HIV/AIDS response has been started later than in other parts of the world, and this is a reason of yes, as you said, an important increase in the number of new infection and in the number of people living with HIV/AIDS.
Dr. Zeitz, I saw you nodding there. Vietnam, for instance, I noticed has a doubling of cases since the year 2000. That seems like an extraordinary jump. What's your take on the interpretation of those kind of figures?
Well, there is the spread of the virus through IV drug use and through sex workers and their clients, and parts of Asia and also parts of North Africa and the Middle East are seeing cases from that form of transmission. In North Africa and the Middle East, there's about 400,000 cases overall of HIV, and just this year there are 35,000 new cases. So the virus is spreading globally, and places like Vietnam are mounting an effective response. They're ramping up their programs, and all countries, including in the region of Al Jazeera, need to step up to the plate and mount a response.
Dr. Parker, I know your organisation looks at the sort of research and evaluation of these kind of things. Is part of the problem that in the past some of the tactics for AIDS have been a sort of one-size-fits-all approach, and does it need to be more specific to different countries, or do you think that there is a kind of a basic approach that ought to work everywhere?
No, it certainly needs to be very specific to the epidemic in each country. So in Southern Africa, for example, there's been a recent research has shown that much of the new infections are occurring around the issue of people having multiple and concurrent partners, which is something that hasn't been particularly strongly focused on in campaigns addressing HIV as far as prevention goes in this country.
OK, gentlemen, do stay where you are. We're going to take a very short break now. When we come back, we'll be asking what the new revised figures mean in terms of prevention measures worldwide and how UNAIDS and the World Health Organization see the locally developed drugs. Do stay with us.